Tom Wilkinson is the host of the hugely popular Thinking in English podcast. And he's been living, studying, researching, teaching, and working in Japan on and off since 2016. So, in this interview, I asked him to teach me about Japan. We spoke at length about his life as a foreigner in the country, what many outsiders and tourists misunderstand about Japan. We spoke about Japanese immigration, his own experience of migrating to Japan, learning Japanese, and what lies in store for the Japan of the future. So, I hope you will enjoy my conversation with Tom Wilkinson. Hello, Tom.
Hi, Alistair. Great to be on the Leonardo English channel.
Perfect. It's wonderful to speak to you again. Now, Tom, we are going to be talking about Japan today. And my first question to you, I guess, is a broad and open one, is why the huge interest in Japan and how did you wind up living in Japan?
I guess my answer will be quite different to a lot of people who you ask this question to. If you asked most, I guess, foreigners living in Japan why they're in Japan, many people would say that they've had an interest in Japan for a long time. That's not my experience and not my reason for being here. If you don't mind a slightly long answer, back when I was at university, I wanted to move abroad. Right, I wanted to go and travel abroad. I'd never traveled abroad as a child. So in my first year at university, I went to University of Nottingham, and they have a campus in Malaysia. So I applied to go to Malaysia for a week. Then when I returned to the UK, I wanted to do something similar the next year. So I went to India with the British Council. Again, I got a scholarship, and I went with the British Council. And when I came back to the UK from India, I had to write a application, I guess, not an application, an essay, right? A summary of my trip for the British Council. So I went on to their website to submit it. But while I was procrastinating, I was looking at all the other opportunities they offer. And they offered, if you were Northern Irish, you could go to the USA for the summer. If there was teaching jobs in Spain or in Argentina, if you spoke Spanish. And then right at the bottom, they had some links to external applications, external projects. And one was called the JET program, right? The Japan Exchange Teaching Program. And this is probably the world's biggest cultural exchange program for young people. They send every year from around the world 2,000 young people to Japan to be teachers, to work as assistant language teachers in schools. They also send some sports coaches and some translators, but they're much smaller numbers. Majority of us were assistant language teachers. And I thought that sounds like a cool opportunity. I was in my final year of university now, and I wanted a job after I graduated. And I thought, okay, I'll apply to this program, and I'll see if I can get a job, have a gap year, go abroad for a year, and then return to the UK and do my master's degree. But I had no interest in Japan. Right? I'd never watched Japanese TV. I'd never listened to Japanese music. I'd never eaten Japanese food. I probably had never met a Japanese person, right? So it was not an interest in Japan that led me to Japan. It was a job. And that was when I arrived in 2016, it was because of a job.
Okay, so 2016, that was 8 years ago, and you're now a permanent resident in Japan, or
well,
almost. You're permanently living in Japan.
Yes. So I have permanent resident has legal meaning in most countries, right? So where my visa status is not permanent resident, my visa status is spouse of a Japanese national, which is technically a permanent resident status. I can stay forever as long as I keep renewing my visa, but it's not a permanent residency. It's slightly different. Hopefully, in a few years' time, I think I have to live here for 3 more years, I will be able to convert to permanent residency, and should allow me to access loans easier, or I could leave the country for longer times and still keep my visa. But yeah, so in the past 8 years, I've actually lived in Japan on 3 separate occasions. I spent 2 years on the island of Shikoku in the south of Japan, in the Ehime prefecture, where I was an assistant language teacher. And so I lived there for 2 years, working in a junior high school and some elementary schools, which was really, really fun, really a really good experience. It taught me a lot of things, gave me a lot of independence, and I learned Japanese in that time. Right, I went from knowing nothing to being able to have conversations and being conversational in Japanese. It also pushed me to change my future plans. I'd always wanted to do a master's degree. I'd actually was thinking of doing um, international politics, but focusing on conflict studies. That was what my interest as an undergraduate was. And I was interested in things like nuclear weapons and these kinds of issues. But being in Japan, I actually thought I want to know more about Japan and more about Asia in general. So I changed. I had an offer to study at King's College London. I had an offer to do conflict studies or non-proliferation studies, I think was the technical term of the course. But
Okay.
on the last possible day, I switched. I changed to go to SOAS and pursue a master's in the politics of Asia or Asian politics, one of those course names. And so I went to London and did my master's degree. And while I was doing my master's degree, I was recommended by my professors to apply for some more research scholarships, opportunities abroad. And I was very lucky. I received 2 scholarships, one to go to Taiwan. So I went to Taiwan for 6 months after I graduated, went to Taiwan and studied Chinese. And then also I had a longer scholarship to be a research student in Japan. And so I came back to Tokyo in 2021, right in the middle of COVID, right in the middle of the pandemic, when Japan's borders were closed to everyone, apart from me, apparently. And I was allowed back in 2021. I then left again a year and a half ago when I came back a year ago to get married to, I guess, my now wife. So that's why I'm now in Japan.
Excellent. And what can you remind me what was the focus of your research in Japan?
In Japan. So I was originally planning on doing a project on what's called, I guess, multicultural coexistence, and that is the English translation of a Japanese term, which kind of means multiculturalism, right? And ideas of citizenship and ideas of immigrant integration. So that's what I was interested in Japan. Back when I was an English teacher, an assistant language teacher, I used to go to these evening Japanese classes. I would go every Tuesday and every Thursday. I would go to the local city center. They were free classes, didn't cost me anything. And I would take classes with other foreigners from the city I was living in and other parts of the prefecture I was living in as well. And I think that some people might, when they picture an immigrant living in Japan or they picture a foreigner living in Japan, I think they often picture the English teachers or the professionals working in the big buildings in Tokyo. But reality is the majority of international people, non-Japanese citizens in Japan, are from Southeast Asia or China or Korea. They are often working in low-paid and quite exploitative jobs. Japan had a system called the Technical Intern and Training Program, which was basically a backdoor to low skill immigration. Japan doesn't accept low skill immigrants, right? So you need a visa. You need a degree to get a visa as a worker in Japan. You need to have gone to university, but not to be an intern. So they had this project to get people in. So that was my research was going to be on Japan changing this rule. They were getting rid of this scheme and they were launching something new, and they were going to allow low-skilled immigration for the first time. I think that was in 2020. But something else happened in 2020, COVID, which meant that no immigrants were allowed in Japan at all for 2 or 3 years. Japan was one of the longest lockdown countries. It was just opening when I left in November 2022. So from March 2020 to November 2022, Japan was closed, which meant my research project didn't do very well. And I kind of had a choice to carry on and go to do a PhD, or to leave and pursue thinking in English. And I didn't really want to spend another 5 years researching in a Japanese university for no money. So I thought I would try and become a podcaster. So that's what I did. Maybe in the future I'll go back and finish my research.
And so that law has now been passed, right? So that is
Yes, yeah, it has, but it's not been. There is now a pathway for low skilled immigrants to become to enter Japan, and also there is a pathway for them to become permanent residents. So, well, actually, Joe Biden earlier this week, whenever we're recording this podcast, but Joe Biden has recently called Japan, Russia, China, and India as xenophobic countries. He made a big speech and he described them as xenophobic countries because they don't accept immigrants. And Russia shouldn't be in that list because Russia does have a massive amount of immigration and migration. But China, India, and Japan definitely are not places that are easy for non-citizens to settle in and work and live permanently for the rest of their lives. There is no clear pathway. And Japan goes even further to have no low-skilled immigration. So that means if you're a cleaner, or if you don't have a degree, basically it's either a degree or 10 years of professional experience is usually what you need to qualify for a visa. If you don't have one of those things, it's hard to come here. But the way around it is that Japan has, I guess that there are some back doors to low skilled immigration. One is spouse visa. Like me, I can do any job in Japan. I could go and work in McDonald's if I wanted to. I could go and be a president of a bank if someone would hire me, right? I could do anything as a spouse visa holder. There is what's called Nikkei Japanese or Nikkei Brazilians or Nikkei Peruvians. They are people, mainly Brazil and Peru, of Japanese descent who their grandparents left Japan in the 1940s, maybe a bit earlier. And Japan has a special family reunion visa for people in this situation to come back to Japan and visit their ancestors and visit their ancestors' graves. But it also has free working rights. So you find a lot of South Americans in Japan, especially working in the car industry and in factories. And then there is the intern program. So the intern program was a scheme where Japan would offer training opportunities to developing countries. So you could come over from Vietnam or the Philippines or Indonesia or China, and you could work in lots of different industries. But rather than being a real intern program, the majority of it was kind of exploitative, low-skilled jobs. People would be paid very little because they're interns. They're not entitled to full salary. And there was, unlike most visas, your visa was attached to your employer. So the way it works in Japan is you have to have someone to guarantee your visa, usually a company. But once you have that visa, if it's for 3 years, you can go find another job, right? And then as long as you tell immigration, you can go. And it doesn't cost the company anything to sponsor you if you're already in the country. So changing jobs, okay. But for an intern, they couldn't do that. It was not easy to change jobs. If their employer wanted them to leave, they just put them on a plane and made them leave. There was no route to regular employment once their 5-year limit was up. So once they hit 5 years, there was no route. This is what they've tried to change. But actually, I think in the last last I saw, there's been less than 5 people who've managed to progress from this status to being a full-time permanent resident of Japan or long-term resident of Japan. So it's a different system compared to other countries. But actually, the UK, for example, is moving into this direction as well of only allowing high-skilled immigration. Um, the UK now, you have to be earning above the average salary to qualify for a visa in the UK, which is harder than it is to qualify in Japan. So the Japan's income requirements are much lower. So I think there are other countries are following into this trend, I think.
What would the so I have two questions. The first one is, would you agree therefore with Joe Biden's categorization of Japan as a xenophobic country?
I guess it's difficult because xenophobic is an emotive word. It conjures emotions and makes people feel. And I don't think the majority of Japanese people hate foreigners, and I don't think Japan hates other countries. But I think there are certain aspects of all countries, but including Japan, where there is maybe perhaps more xenophobia present. And in one of those things, it would be in um, sort of this visas, I guess, immigration, the legal procedures around it. And it's interesting because Japan is really a quite easy country to get certain visa statuses, right? And actually, before we started recording this podcast, I was talking to Alistair about how expensive it would have been for me to move as a spouse to Japan compared to my wife moving to the UK as my spouse. And to move to Japan, it took me from getting married to living to having a resident status in Japan was 6 weeks. I applied for my visa. I got married in Japan, which was free. Applied for my visa, which was free to apply for. And then when I received my status, I had to pay £25, 4,000 yen. To move to the UK, it would cost £1,890 for the visa application, which you have to pay before. And if the visa application fails, you don't get your money back. You also have to pay for some biometric testing, an English test for my wife. You'd have to pay for health insurance in advance for however long your visa is. So all of these, it was so much easier to move to Japan. So that's definitely not a sign of a xenophobic country, as they're so welcoming and allowing of people in my situation. But I am guaranteed by a Japanese citizen, right? And that
Mm.
is, I think, the difference is that I am guaranteed by a Japanese citizen. A Japanese citizen has to be responsible for me, right? And if as with any visa, if that guarantee ends, you have to leave, right? And so I think but there are. The USA is not necessarily. Joe Biden was criticizing countries for being xenophobic. The USA is not an
Mm.
unxenophobic country when it comes to immigration. The USA is one of the hardest places to get visas for, right? And getting a marriage visa to move to the USA takes a year and a half compared to taking me 6 weeks less than 6 weeks
Mm.
because I had to apply after I got married, right? So all of it's. I think the word xenophobic is very emotive and often used for political reasons. But Japan is not the easiest place to live and exist as a non-citizen for many reasons. But don't necessarily know if that means it's xenophobic or if it's just
Mm.
unflexible, right? Not suited
Yeah.
to the changing global world.
I guess he's referring to xenophobic immigration policies, meaning it is not as easy to arrive as a non-Japanese person unless you have these certain links to Japanese uh, Japanese society, whether that's through marriage or through a grandparent or through an employer. But
Yeah,
I
and that's
guess,
most
yeah,
countries.
that's
I think that's most
yeah,
countries. The
yeah.
EU, and I'm sure many of your listeners will be from the EU and are blessed with the freedom of movement, right? And we used to be. Well, I know you're an Italian citizen, whereas I'm not. I'm purely UK citizen, which means I don't have freedom of movement in Europe anymore. Um, and say if I went to, I would now have to apply for a not a visa. I can't remember what it's called to go to Europe, but it's not guaranteed that I'd be allowed to go to Europe anymore. And with visa applications with anywhere, there always has to be someone guaranteeing your status until you reach permanent residency, where you basically
Mm,
guarantee you've proved that you are responsible, worthy of living in the country, or you become a citizen by naturalization, which is, I guess, the final step, and then you are legally considered a member of that country.
yeah. But in terms of sheer numbers of immigrants to Japan, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but unless I'm mistaken, Japan, as a percentage of its population, has a relatively low number of immigrants, right?
Yeah, I think it reached a peak this year. I can't remember the exact number, but it's been rising, but it's definitely below. It's in the single figure digits of percentages. It's definitely below 10%, I think. Um,
Yeah.
and that is not, again, it's not as there's Japan's inflexible. I think that's the reality, and it's not that it's inflexible on purpose. But if you want to move to Japan and work in Japan, you need to speak Japanese, which is a challenging language to learn, a challenging language to reach full proficiency in. If you're not fully fluent in Japanese, if you can't read and write in Japan's alphabetic system, kanji, your opportunities are limited, right? You could be an English teacher if you could work in manual labor if you're if you're a spouse, or if you're an international student, you could go and get a part-time job in a factory because you don't need to read and write to work in a factory. um, but you can't become a doctor if you can't speak Japanese to full
Mm,
fluency. You can't become a lawyer, right? An accountant. These kinds of professions require high levels of language, and I think a lot of people misunderstand, or always forget how difficult it is to learn a language to full fluency, to a level where you are
mm,
able to be be a high level communicator, and especially in a language like Japanese, which is only spoken in Japan. So it's not like English, where if you learn English, you've got the USA, Canada, the UK, you've got even parts of Europe will accept English as a working language. Australia, New Zealand, parts of Africa, parts of Asia. Japan is only, so you're learning a language purely for one country. And I think there aren't enough people who speak the language fluently to move there and
mm.
make their life successfully in the country. And it's something that I'm working on. I study Japanese every day. I make sure to do an hour of study every day because I want to be eventually a fully fluent communicator. I can speak, I can converse in Japanese. I'm okay at Japanese, but I can't write very well, right? So that's one thing I'm working on. I can't. Uh, my understanding of Japan's alphabet is probably about a middle school student. Should probably be more like a university student. So it's um, it's going to take time, but it does take time. I think that's the issue.
I just as you were speaking there, I was looking up the foreign-born population of Japan, which is 2.3% of the population as of 2021, apparently,
Yep.
but has increased by 35% since 2011.
Yes. Yeah.
And the
So it's increasing.
main countries of birth. I have this is OECD, so I'm just taking it as as correct. Main countries of birth being China 26%,
Yep.
Korea 16%, and Vietnam 11%.
Yeah,
So that's
like I said
yeah,
at the beginning.
oh,
Yeah, so
yeah,
Southeast Asia, China, and Korea are the biggest immigrant populations in Japan, and often, especially China and Korea, they're often, I guess, I can't remember the technical term, but you could describe them as invisible migrants. You can't clearly see the difference between a Chinese person and a Japanese person. I'm sure some of your listeners might say, "Oh, I can see the difference," but it's much harder to see the differences compared to me when I'm walking through the streets of the town I live in, and I'm one of, if not the only, uh, European white person in the town.
yeah,
So I think that's why people often, when they have images of foreigners in Asia, they always forget that there are other Asians who are foreigners in Asia. And often they have a much harder time of adjusting to life in Japan because they are, if I go to a restaurant, the restaurant staff never expect me to be able to speak Japanese. And when I can speak Japanese, they are pleasantly surprised. But if a Korean person was to go to a restaurant in the city I live in, they would be expected to speak Japanese. And when they don't speak
mm,
Japanese, it would be a bit confusing for the restaurant staff. So I think
mm.
often people from other parts of Asia have a just as challenging time to integrate into Japanese society.
Okay. Um, yeah, I mean, 2.3% of the population is perhaps that's more than people thought. Perhaps it's less. I think the UK is something like 12. I think 12 or 15. I think
Yeah,
is something like that. So it's interesting for people to think to kind of to see the difference, and maybe as you say, people who've traveled to Japan or have this impression of what a foreigner in Japan looks like haven't fully understood that in fact there are many more foreigners in Japan than they might think because of this category of invisible
yeah,
invisible migrants, invisible foreigners who are in fact the majority of immigrants in Japan.
yeah, yes, definitely. And they're often, I think people when they visit Japan, they go to the tourist hotspots. Right? You go to Tokyo, you go to Osaka, you go to Kyoto, but there are international people spread around the entire country, from the smallest villages to the biggest cities, because there are there is, especially in the countryside, in fact, there aren't enough people to do certain jobs, which is where this intern training program comes in. And if you're a farmer in the north of Honshu, right, the north of Japan's main island, where it's cold and where the population is decreasing every year, there are no young people left. No one wants to be a farmer. You're not going to have a. It's not a regular job. Your income is not guaranteed. You don't have a salary, so they often need to hire cheaper foreign workers as interns to do their manual labor. So often you will see uh, foreigners in or Southeast Asian people or Chinese people or Korean people in other parts of the country, right? They'll be in places you might not expect because that's where the need for labor is most identified. Whereas I
Mm,
think if you're a professional Western worker, or even Asian, if you're a professional worker, you'll be in Tokyo. You might be in Osaka. But if you're an English teacher, you could be anywhere in the entire country. And if you're working in one of these slightly more low skilled jobs as an intern, you'll be more likely where they need, where those industries are based. If you're in farming, you'll be in the countryside. Factories will be in the industrial um, heartland. I used to live in Shikoku, which has the city I lived in was next to Imabari, and Imabari Shipbuilding, I think, is the world's biggest or third biggest shipbuilding company. And there were people
mm,
from all around the world working in shipbuilding relating industries. Right? There were Filipino ship divers who uh, were diving underneath the boats, cleaning the bottom of boats. There were Vietnamese people working in factories making components for the boats. There were Chinese engineers working on the ships as well. And so but they were all in the island of Shikoku, which most Japanese people have never been to because it's hard to get to.
Mm.
There's no bullet train, right? There's no Shinkansen train to that island. So it's, labor tends to go to where the work is needed. And
Mm.
if you're working in shipbuilding, you'll be in near the coast, probably in Imabari.
But still, all that being true, 2.3% is very low compared to
Very low.
other countries. I was just checking the UK one. It's 14.8%. So to what extent do you think the reason for the reason for the fact that it's so low is because of Japanese policies that have made it harder for people to move there versus Japanese being a very difficult language to learn and people just not being able to get the kind of jobs that they would want to move to Japan.
So
Like, how much is it Japan putting up walls versus people just not wanting to go?
it's definitely the first one, right? And there was a conscious decision. I can't remember the researchers' names, but I read their book. I read a few books about this topic actually, and in the 1950s and 60s, Europe was experimenting for the first time with sort of mass immigration. Right? There's always been people moving around the world. There's always been people leaving Europe, right, or moving around Europe. Um, but after World War II, Europe was destroyed, and the former great empires of Britain and France and Germany needed help rebuilding their countries. So Britain relied on Caribbean immigrants and immigrants from South Asia. France looked to its colonies in Africa, and Germany partnered with Turkey and places like that, right? And so they started these schemes to bring people into their countries. And while multiculturalism is a great thing and has been a great success in many countries in diversifying and building the economy and keeping population rates high, in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, there were race riots, right? There were problems all across Europe from this situation of immigration for the first time, and Asian countries, including Japan, but also Korea and Taiwan, looked at Europe and they saw problems. And so when they were designing their systems to bring immigrants into their countries, they did so in a way where they would limit the opportunities for the problems that was happening in Europe. And they did this by saying that you can come and work here, you can work in Japan, you can earn money in Japan, but once your job's ended, you'll go home. Right?
Mm.
Once if you're not working, you'll go home. Usually, maybe you can stay for 1 year, you can stay for 5 years. You'll go home once you've finished. Exceptions, of course, are made for people who are married to Japanese citizens, but and now there are routes for high skilled workers, people with very high PhDs and qualifications. They could become permanent residents. But traditionally, Asia decided that rather than integrating immigrants into their cultures like Europe tried to, right? France described everyone as French, right? France has a race-blind system to immigration. The UK and Germany tried slightly more multicultural approaches, allowing people to retain some of their ethnic, some of their ethnic, I guess, background or religion and cultures in a slightly more open way. Japan said, "You do what you want, but you'll go home at the end," right? If if your children are born in Japan, they're not Japanese. Yeah, if you have to go home, right? Your child has no right to be Japanese, right? Unless you're a Japanese citizen. So I think that is it was there were pillars in place in Japan's immigration system based on the experience of what Europe went through after World War II. And I'm not saying that those experiences that Europe went through mean that immigration is a bad thing, because it doesn't mean that. But it was the conditions under which Asia, including Japan, was designing their policies. And it was not just
Okay.
Japan. Think about Australia. Australia had white only immigration until surprisingly recently. Australia had the White Australia program, which I think ended in the
Mm.
80s. So you couldn't move to Australia unless you were white, right? Because they had a white only immigration policy. Again, based on the experience of what Europe was going through, of trying to integrate people from different cultures into their societies. And Australia said, we don't want these problems. Let's just take more British people, right? Let's just take
Mm.
more people from the UK, because
From
we
Malta.
already have UK culture, so we'll take some more. This obviously has changed now, right? Australia has changed a lot since they got
Mm.
rid of White Australia program. Um, but yeah, a lot of countries took a slightly more mm, negative view of long-term immigration, permanent immigration. Uh, want, once Britain and Germany and France and other European countries kind of opened their borders to help for immigrants to come and rebuild their countries, which they really needed.
So the so post World War II Japan, the rebuilding process was constructed primarily by Japanese people.
Yeah, so there's always been non-Japanese people in Japan, at least in modern history. So a really nice way I saw it put in a book I read during my master's degree was that when Japan surrendered at the end of World War II, Japan went from being a multicultural empire to a homogenous nationalist country overnight. Right? They went from being a multicultural empire where all citizens of its empire were Japanese. So that
Mm.
meant the Koreans and the Taiwanese who had moved to Japan to, under Imperial Japan, they were they were still there, right? They're still here today. There are still populations of Korean and Chinese and Taiwanese people in Japan, who many of them are still not citizens. They have a special residency situation. They're described as special permanent residents, because they weren't ethnically Japanese. They weren't entitled to Japanese citizenship after World War II ended. But they weren't. They might have been born in Japan, and they were Japanese
Mm.
citizens before World War II ended. But when
Yeah.
World War II ended, they were then Korean, or they were then Chinese. But Korea went into war pretty quickly afterwards. Japan was destroyed. Korea went into war. China went into war. So yeah, I think it's important to point out there has always been ethnic diversity in Japan. But you're right, most of the rebuilding of Japan after World War II was done by Japanese people. But you can't neglect the importance of the USA or of the Korean War. Because without the Korean War, Japan would probably have just been left by the USA, neglected. But
Mm.
when the communists and South Korea went to war, a proxy war between China and the Soviet Union and China and the USA, where was the best place to build planes and
Mm.
build tanks? Well, Japan, the country the USA was occupying. And then when the Korean War ended, where did all of those heavy machinery go to? The Japanese steel industry, the Japanese car industry. So the Korean War allowed Japan to rebuild much more successfully than other countries destroyed by war.
Okay. And the policy that Japan kind of put into place after seeing the impact of after seeing European policies towards immigration. That Japanese policy has remained more or less unchanged since then. Is that correct?
Well,
With a few minor
there's
kind of
always
policy changes.
developments and changes in immigration, and I think it's easier to move to Japan now than it has been in the past. Um, there used to be minimum salary requirements, and there still are minimum salary requirements, but they're lower than they used to be. I know in the 1990s, the minimum salary to move to Japan was 250,000 yen a month, and I know people earning less than that, so it must be lower at the moment. And I
How
think
much is that roughly? Sorry, for people who might
uh,
not be so familiar with
250.
yen.
The exchange rate is fluctuating quite a lot at the moment, but I would say 250,000 yen is about £1,700,
What at
£800.
the moment apparently it's 1,508 euros.
Oh, okay, so
Um,
it's less than that in pounds. Probably £1,300. So
which
yeah.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, but the exchange rate is fluctuating, so it's hard. It's always hard to do foreign exchange. And myself and Alistair, we work with international companies. We live in different countries to where our citizenship is, and we move around. It always gets confusing. One day you're earning one amount in
Yeah.
pounds, and the next day you're earning half the amount because the exchange rate changed. So it always changes.
And then you switch it up to yen, and
Yes,
there are
exactly,
many more zeros.
exactly. I'm a millionaire in yen.
Well, you try going to Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe,
Um,
yeah.
um, okay, and was this? To what extent did you kind of know about this? About kind of multiculturalism and immigration in Japan before you arrived there,
Oh,
and
nothing.
to what extent was this like this sort of book based research versus going out and speaking to Chinese immigrants and Korean immigrants and
Well, so
Vietnamese immigrants and so on?
the first 2 years I lived in Japan, I was a teacher, right? I hadn't done any research yet. I hadn't, and this is where I came up with the idea for this project going forward. And those 2 years I spent going to the Japanese language classes in the evening, and I realized how important these language classes were for immigrants in Japan, right? These are places where the teachers who were not professional teachers, they were volunteers. They were incredibly important resources for the community of for the Vietnamese community and for the Filipino community and for the even for me for the English teaching community. Right, they would disseminate information to us. Right, they would help us with applications, right? They would, if we had problems with our jobs, not so much me, I worked for the city government, so I was fine. But for people who were working for private companies, um, these classes offered an opportunity to interact with Japanese people who were not their employer, which was quite rare because they were probably working in a fully Vietnamese environment, right, just with their own colleagues, or a fully Filipino environment, just with their colleagues, and their Japanese interaction would be with their employer who holds their visa, right? So this was an opportunity to talk to other Japanese people and meet other people from around the world, and yeah, it was kind of a social opportunity to meet people as well. It's how I met some of my friends, was going to these events, and I think I actually go to similar classes here now, 6 years later. Now where I live now, every Friday morning, I go to this basically the same idea. It's not free, but it does cost £2 a class, which I'm sure your listeners have taken English classes online and know that no one is charging £2 a class. But that's what I pay for my Japanese classes. I go for £2, and it's again an opportunity for the local population of immigrants to meet other people, to interact with each other, but also to have some kind of support system. Right? There's always a poster on the
Mm.
wall: "Is your company exploiting you? call this number in 8 languages. Right? There's always an opportunity to talk with the staff at the International Association in this city who run the classes. They have an American or Canadian staff member. They have a Chinese staff member, and they have a Vietnamese contractor who's on the phone if you need to go and speak in Vietnamese. Right? They offer these
Okay.
opportunities,
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's. And I learned this from when I was living in Shikoku, and when I went back and did my master's degree, I actually wrote my thesis on a slightly different topic. I wrote my thesis on indigenous people in Japan, particularly the Ainu living in the very north of Hokkaido in Japan. But it's still related to ideas of citizenship and multi-ethnic policies. But yeah, when I came back to Tokyo, it's what I wanted to research. And yeah, there is definitely differences between sort of book-based research, reading policies, and then the real lived experiences, which is interesting because I'm sure you know this as well, Alistair. When you're applying for visas or you're moving to another country, it's one thing to read the official government website saying what you need to do and what your experience is going to be, and another thing actually doing that. Right, like I've
Mm.
moved to Japan so I started thinking in English as a hobby, and then it got successful. Right after I had moved back to the UK, and I came back to Japan, and I'm sole proprietor. I'm a freelancer, and reading online, it's like, oh, a freelancer can a person with a spouse visa can do anything can do any work in Japan, and can open bank accounts. As a freelancer, you can also open bank accounts, but I have been turned down by a lot of banks. Right, so the law, the rules online
Mm.
say that I should be able to open these things, but sometimes they turn me down. In fact, a local insurance um, place I went to try and get some extra health insurance, like pay for extra health insurance. She asked me. She spent 30 minutes talking to me in Japanese first to make sure I spoke Japanese well enough, even though language is normally. I think there is a requirement that you understand the documentation, but if you
Okay.
go with my wife, who's my translator, they shouldn't need to quiz me for 30 minutes. But they did. I passed, but it's
Mm.
there's these things where the law is very different from the real lived experience, and you don't know that until you live in the place.
Well, Tom, you said earlier that you had a conversational level of Japanese. I feel like if you're holding a 30-minute conversation with someone about insurance, then you're being too modest about your Japanese abilities.
There's a lot of
I'm not sure
guessing.
I could.
There's a lot of guessing.
There's-
There's a lot of repeating of words, assuming that I know what that type of insurance means. But
yeah,
yeah,
because I would imagine that the word for, I don't know, excess waiver or deductible or things like that it sounds very different in Japanese to what
yeah,
the English
and
version is.
yes,
And
and
probably lots of people reading insurance documentation in English wouldn't understand they wouldn't understand the words
100%,
anyway.
100%, because it's actually something I tell to the listeners of my podcast quite often is English speakers, even if you're Polish and a Polish speaker, if you're Italian and Italian speaker, you don't understand your language all the time. Right? If I gave you the terms and conditions of Apple subscription, and it's 300 pages of jargon in any language, no one's going to understand that. Right? It's legal
Mm,
speak or financial speak or insurance speak or medical speak. In fact, my wife speaks better medical English than I do because of her job, right? So there's, she knows words for illnesses that I don't, because I would just say, he's
yeah.
sick. Oh, he's something's wrong with him, right? Where she actually knows what the word is. So yeah, I think it's important to remember that there are different levels of proficiency even within native speakers. So
Yeah. Well, if you've mastered or if you're able to hold a 30-minute conversation about insurance, that perhaps that is perhaps that's a better test of proficiency than any IELTS exam.
Yeah, maybe. But I keep failing the Japanese proficiency test because I don't know enough characters. So that's what I got to learn. I got to study the reading part.
So, um, thinking about you and also about other foreigners living in Japan who, they are studying their Japanese, they are kind of integrating as much as they possibly can into Japanese society. In your opinion, is it ever possible for a non-Japanese person to become Japanese? And you can interpret becoming Japanese in however way you see fit.
Um, Legally, yes. Japan has a naturalization process. It's actually relatively simple compared to some other countries. Um, it used to be a lot more complicated. You used to have to show that you live the Japanese life. So they would come and they would check if you slept on the floor on a futon or if you slept in a bed. They check these kinds of things, but they don't. They're not that
You
strict
have to live
anymore.
a Japanese life
You
to
used to in the
become.
past.
You,
Yeah.
okay.
So that also required taking a Japanese name, right? So to
Yeah.
adopting a Japanese name, but that's not anymore, right? It's now simpler to naturalize. So from a legal perspective, yes, you can become Japanese. Um, then you have the same complexity you have with any any country which is basically homogenous and monocultural, monoethnic. So Japanese is both a nationality and an ethnicity, right? And so I can't become ethnically Japanese, but I can legally
Mm.
become Japanese. And then you have the middle ground of culturally. Can you ever become culturally another Japanese? And that's I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer. I know people who've lived here for a long time, but I don't know if they themselves feel culturally Japanese. And I think it's one of the big differences between the multicultural um, states of Europe compared to Japan and other Asian countries is if my wife and I moved to the UK and we had children, my children would be British, right? And my wife eventually, if she became a citizen, she'd eventually be British, right? People would just describe her as British. I don't think the same is true for me here. I don't think I would.
Mm.
I don't think anyone would ever describe if I naturalized. I don't think anyone would ever believe me
Yeah.
if I said I'm Japanese. It might take a. They might
You'd
have to
be an
check my.
English guy who speaks very good Japanese.
Yeah, even if I had the passport. So Japan only allows single nationality. You can't be a dual citizen
Okay.
of Japan. So if I was to naturalize in the future, I don't plan to, but if I was to naturalize, I'd have to give up my UK citizenship. So I would just be Japanese. I wouldn't be a dual citizen
Mm.
anymore. But even in that situation where I have a Japanese passport, I'm no longer British. I own a house in Japan. I have lived there for 40 years. I honestly don't know the answer because right now I might say it would be difficult. I don't know many long term immigrants who consider themselves or feel themselves to be Japanese, but in 40 years' time, but perhaps right things might change because if we look at Europe 40 years ago, there were protests when the England chose the first black footballers to play in the English football
Mm.
team. But now if you look at most European football teams, they're made up by people from immigrant families or descendants of immigrants, and they're often, most of the time, but a majority of people considered British, right? Considered French, considered German, because of that's where they were born. That's where they grew up. That's where they were educated. It's the language
Mm.
they speak. It's the team they represent. Um, but 40 years ago there were protests. So I think if we look in the future, I don't know. I don't know I don't know whether Japan will change its idea of identity. I would guess not. Right at the moment, I would guess not. Japan is quite an insular country. It's um, it's very nationalist. There's a perception that being Japanese is unique. It's a unique identity. So I don't know whether that would change in the future.
Okay, well, that actually leads me kind of nicely onto another set of questions or a set of things that I would like to talk about. Is if you're looking into your crystal ball, and if someone asks you, where will Japan be in 50 or 100 years, what would you say?
Again, a very challenging question. There was an article that kind of went viral in Japan last week or a few weeks ago, and it was listing the towns in Japan which will cease to exist in the future at the current population rate. And in fact, where I live right now, a city of over 100,000 people, is at risk of dying out, is at risk of becoming extinct based on current population trends. And there are two factors. There's the mix between urbanization, people moving to the big cities because that's where the best jobs are, and leaving the countryside. Right, so you leave this. I live in Fukushima, right, in the countryside. So leaving the countryside to go and live in Tokyo or Osaka, and then the population decline. Right, less people are having babies all around the world, Europe included, but less people are having babies, and the population is not growing. Now, what's different? We've talked about this a lot, but what's different between Japan and Europe is there's very little long-term immigration in Japan to replace people. So if you look at France, I think France is the only European country which has a healthy birth rate, and it's often because they accept immigrants, right? And the same reason why is the UK population still growing, even though the UK birth rate's low. But Japan doesn't accept immigrants to that level. Like you said, 2% of the population only. So it's not making up the difference. So the future of Japan will either be a lot of cities and villages dying out, the population getting older, and young people not being as common as they are right now, right? Less and less young people to support the older generations who are living for longer as healthcare is getting better. Um, and that will have a whole array of economic problems and things that come along with that. Or there is a chance that Japan might make a change, but they might start to uh, open up immigration a little bit more. Or that seems to not be a politically popular choice right now. So they might try and do things to try and stimulate the economy, or they might try to do things to try and encourage people to get married and have children, because that's the thing they need to do is get married and have children. So they might adopt policies like Scandinavia has of better provision for young children in terms of childcare, better policies for maternity leave, better work-life balance, shorter work days. Japan has a tough working culture for many people, right? There's long hours, long hours, tough conditions, little holiday. It does have the world's longest paternity leave and the world's longest maternity leave, but they're not fully paid, right? So you can take up to a year off work, but you don't get paid for that. So no one can afford to take a year off work, right? So I think introducing policies like Scandinavia has to try and encourage people to be more comfortable having children. And the big thing is having 2 children is not enough to repopulate.
Yeah,
Right?
just the replacement rate, right? It's 2.1, no?
Yeah, exactly. The replacement rate is 2.1. Oh, the replacement rate is 2. So you need to have an average of 2.1 children per couple for a population to grow. But so you need to encourage bigger families. And so that is a real challenge because, people might want one child. But if you live I think this happens in South Korea a lot. You're in Seoul, you're in an expensive apartment, which is a 1-bed apartment or a 2-bed apartment. How are you going to fit 3 children into your family home? Right? So there needs to be more affordable housing. These kinds of things. There needs to be uh, better opportunities for people to get on the property market. Um, all of these issues, because you need people to have 3 children to get above the population rate. In fact, you need people to be having 4 children because a lot of people won't have any children. So these are the kinds of things people don't always think about it. So I think the future of Japan in terms of population will be a big theme in Japan in the future, because of these dying out cities, these dying out villages, and the elderly population just increasing and becoming more of a strain on the economy, as you have more and more retired people who are supposedly being funded by the taxes of the people paying today. But if there aren't enough children to pay, you just get more and more challenging. So I think that would be one big theme for the future.
And I guess also thinking more about what you said in terms of immigration, the difficulty of coming to Japan, and even if you do manage to get to Japan, you're always sort of, for most people, you're kind of a visitor there. As soon as your link breaks, whether that's marriage or employer or whatever, you're off. I would imagine that people in that situation might not feel so good about paying for the pensions of elderly Japanese people if they are not afforded any of the same benefits of citizenship or any of that kind of stuff. You're just literally you're there to be supporting an aging population,
Yeah,
and as soon as your employment ends, then back to where you came from.
yeah, it's an interesting tax and insurance payments and things are always an interesting uh, sort of challenge and thing that it poses when you're moving abroad and living overseas. Pensions are kind of unique because not every country, but a lot of countries have equalization treaties or totalization treaties, meaning if you pay your pension in Japan for 10 years and you move to the USA, you can take that with you. You can say to the USA, I paid 10 years worth of social security in Japan. Now, please give me 10 years worth in the UK, in USA. And actually, they give you your pension back in Japan. If you leave, they give it to you back. Um,
Okay.
so when I first left in 2018, I received the payment of my pension a year after I left. I submitted to the Japanese
Okay.
government. I'd left, and they paid me back my pension. But yeah, it is a challenge, and I often I see on message boards and Reddit and social media people thinking about their future in a certain country. So whether it's Japan or whatever country, but planning for your future, living somewhere where you're not a citizen, is always a risk because during COVID, Japan locked out not Japan locked out permanent residents for a few weeks. I think a few months, in fact. So permanent residents are supposed to have the same travel rights as citizens. They were supposed to be allowed into the country, but Japan made the decision to only allow Japanese citizens to enter the country. So that meant people who lived in Japan for 25 years, owned businesses, had paid tax for 25 years, had children, grandchildren in Japan, weren't allowed to come back if they were overseas during COVID because the borders got locked. So that is a risk that everyone, all of your listeners, kind of need to have in the back of their mind, is that when you live somewhere where you're not a citizen, you don't have the rights of a citizen. Right? You might feel incredibly comfortable in a place. You might be paying tax. You might set up a business, but you're not a citizen of that country. And if something went wrong in the world, like a pandemic, often that's revealed. Right? Often that's revealed that you can't come back, right? Or
Mm.
these kinds of issues. And then there are other complexities about making sure you pay enough pension so that you can actually be given the pension when you retire in Japan, if this is where you're planning on living. But yeah, I feel like it's a challenge that both myself and you, Alistair, will face because we both live in countries different to where we grew up and our citizenship. I'm in Japan. You're in Sweden. It's when we're thinking long term. I will probably live here for a long time. I might even retire here. I might even die in Japan in long, long, long in the future. I hope. Um, but there's always a risk with that. If you're not a citizen, there's
Mm.
always something that could go wrong. It could always be.
Yeah.
You could always be deported, right? Because even if you have permanent residency, it doesn't mean you can't be deported from a country for something that might even be a minor infraction of a law, right? Speeding on the highway too often, or something. They might just say, we're not going to renew your visa. So then you have to leave, right? So I'm sure there would be legal reasons and law cases and expensive lawyers you could pay to argue for you. But if you're a citizen, you have the security of being a citizen. But if you're like me and you're my visa is dependent on my wife, there's always a risk.
And I presume that for the majority of those, that 2.3% of the foreign-born population, they're in a similar kind of situation to you, in terms of
Majority,
they probably
I'd assume, yeah.
haven't done full naturalization.
Yeah, well, I'd
And
be interested to see the breakdown, but I would assume employment visas and student visas are the biggest of that proportion.
Yeah.
And there will be much smaller numbers of spousal visa holders and dependent visa holders, other kinds of visas there are. But I think it's if you're a worker, unless you get permanent residency, you're at the whim of the immigration office, right? Or at the whim of your company to renew you. And it's always a challenge. It's why the EU is such a unique thing of being able to go and live in another country and work in another country without having to worry about you can still get deported from EU countries, but you don't have, if you're Spanish and you want to go to France to work on your for 6 months, you can, right? If you want to buy a house in Germany, you don't have to worry about not being allowed to go there too often. Because if there's lots of British people who bought houses in Spain, but now they're not allowed to be in Spain for longer than 180 days within a 360-day period. So, there's a lot of complexities that come with immigration and visas and borders, and I think it's often seen as it's often romanticized and quite simply put in the headline stories of people moving abroad, people buying a second house in another country. Well, it doesn't work like that most of the time. Most of the time, it's a much more challenging and complex and precarious. I think the word is often precarious they use in academia. They talk about people with precarious situations. And if you're on a 1-year work visa, which is continually renewed, well, what happens if if your company goes bankrupt 2 months before your next visa renewal and you don't have time to find a new company? Well, you're gone, right? They give you a few months to try and find a new job, but if you can't find a new job, well, you have to go. Even if you lived here for 5 years and your savings are in a Japanese bank and you have a credit card and you bought a car, well, if you don't have a job, there's not much they can do for you, right? So,
Yeah, it's and I guess also if you're on that kind of, if your status in a country is so precarious, then you're less likely to want to do things like start a family or properly put down roots and perhaps contribute to Japan's aging population and do a little bit to solve that. It's really interesting you talking about the fact that politically in Japan, encouraging higher levels of immigration would not be a popular move, because it would seem like if the kind of if the one of the biggest problems facing Japan is this aging population and a shrinking number of younger people, that is that is a tried and tested way of fixing that problem, or at least changing the makeup, changing the demographic makeup, and probably easier and cheaper than doing things like building new houses and encouraging better parental leave and doing all the other things that might encourage people to have more children. But yeah, it's fascinating because I've read quite a bit about it, but from Western publications that are looking outwardly at the subject, and maybe there's some interview with a 25-year-old Japanese person who says these are the reasons that I don't want to have children, blah blah. But it's interesting to hear you say that politically that would not be something that is popular in Japan. Why do you think that is?
I think going back to what we talked about at the beginning, certain there still is xenophobia in Japanese society. I think it's quite targeted. So there's um, the privilege of being a British person, a white British person, means that people tend be to not care if I live in a house next to them, right? They're probably usually, as long as I follow the rules, right, people don't care too much. But if you were to open the doors to immigration, you open it to other parts of the world where there are still xenophobic thoughts about, right? So if you were to open it to Southeast Asia or to China or to Africa, right, I think that would be far less popular. And that's why Japan's current policies are all about attracting high skilled immigrants, right? Like if you have a PhD, you can, there's a track to become a permanent resident in 1 year, right? So you can become a permanent resident of Japan, give you the right to live here, to get bank loans, credit cards, all of these things. Everything apart from voting, basically, you can achieve that in 1 year, which is quicker than the spousal route, which usually takes 3 years. If you're highly qualified enough, if you have enough industry experience, if you have a high enough salary, if you have enough savings, if you have high enough Japanese language ability, you can if you're high skilled, it can take 1 year or 3 years or 5 years, but you can become that permanent resident quicker than the usual 10 years of living in Japan, which usually is what it takes. So I think, definitely xenophobia is part of the reason why. And it's because a lot of the shortages of jobs in Japan, same as all countries, it's all rich countries, right? Rich countries. It's not highly skilled jobs which there's shortages in, right? Japan doesn't need British accountants. Japan doesn't need, American software developers, right? They need they need people to work in the shops. They need people to work in supermarkets. They need people to be working in the caring industry. They need nurses. They need farmers, right? This is the kind of industries where there are shortages, because it's the same in the UK. Same. I'm sure in many of the people have hopes to have a higher paid job, right? People have hopes to have success and to go to university. And in Japan, the dream for many people is to work for a big company, not a role specifically, but just to work for a big company, to work for Mitsubishi, to work for Panasonic, for Sony, for Sumitomo Corporation. But that means that no one really wants to do the lower skilled jobs. I can't remember the name of the documentary, but it came out. It was I don't know if it was Oscar nominated, but it was about a toilet cleaner in Tokyo, right? And he's a Japanese guy, and it's a really I'll have to send you the name of the documentary later for you to put in the description, because it's a really interesting documentary on the life of this guy who is a Japanese toilet cleaner. Now, in the UK, majority of cleaning jobs are done by overseas people born in different countries, right? Like the cleaners from my high school, from my university, from they were never British citizens, or they might have been British citizens, but they were always born in different countries. They might eventually become citizens. But Japan, no, Japanese people have to do those low skilled jobs because there's no route to low skilled immigration other than international students working part time. Right. So I think in the future, this might change. It might become more open. They might try and attract more high skilled immigration, but that's not what they need. Right? Um, they need lower skilled immigration, and if they want to tackle the population challenges, the biggest thing is just to encourage people to have families, right, and to take some of the pressure off people. And I think you can achieve this with immigration, right? You can achieve it with immigration, but there are other ways of solving it, and it could, I think the biggest thing for Japan is they need to make it more attractive for young people to get married and have families and have children. And whether that's bigger tax breaks, whether it's better care for um, for babies, I think that's what they need to change most, because working conditions are not. I'm sure there are some great jobs here, but I know a lot of people who work very long hours, right? Very, very long hours, especially in Tokyo. People who work from 7, 8 a.m. until 10 p.m. They work 6 days a week. They're always on the phone, even on the days off. I think that's what
Mm.
they need to change. Because how do you have time to have children if you're working 14 hours a day? And then how do you have time to have more than one child, right? Like, and why would a partner want to have another child with someone who is not there? They're working all the time.
Yeah.
Um, that's the big challenge, right? You might be able to have one child, but usually it's the wife who's at home caring for the child. If the husband's working 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and the wife's already tired from caring for one child, are they going to want to care for four? Probably not. But Japan needs people to
Yeah.
have 3 or 4 children. So
Well, it will certainly be interesting to see how things change in the years to come. Um, Now, just one kind of final question that is perhaps a useful one for people who might be traveling to Japan or think about living or spending some time in Japan, even though it's not so easy as we have spent the past hour talking about. What what are kind of three things that you would say people misunderstand about Japan?
misunderstand. Well, just before we get into that, to go back to your point of saying it's not that easy to move to Japan. Well, it depends. It can be easy to move to Japan. It was easy for me to move as a spouse, right?
Mm,
Many countries have working holiday relationships with Japan. So if you come from Europe, you can probably come to Japan on a working holiday visa for a year. So if you want to come to Japan and work and go on vacation for a year, you can. It's usually relatively easy to get that visa. And then if you're a native English speaker, you don't need any qualifications other than a degree in an unrelated subject to be an English teacher in Japan, right? So
mm,
you get
okay.
very low quality English teachers out here because it's one of the easiest countries to get a visa for to be an English teacher. So it's not that it's hard to move to Japan, but it's hard to attain a. I think it's hard to get a high quality job. It's hard to get a high paying high quality job. It takes people a lot of time to kind of get into those positions, and unless they were transferred in from overseas. And I think it's hard to set up your life in a way that you're comfortable with. I think but visiting and living in Japan are very different, and it's the same for every country. When you live somewhere, it's completely different to visiting as a tourist. Often it's better, often it's worse. Right? You might love Japan as a tourist, but hate it as a person who lives here. So that's probably um, something that people do misunderstand is when you're visiting a country, remember you're a tourist. All of the vast majority of your conversations with people are you're engaging in an economic relationship. You're paying the person, the tour guide, you're paying the coffee staff, you're paying the taxi driver. That's an economic relationship. So people always say, wow, people in Japan were so kind and so nice to me. But you paid them, most likely, right? The bar staff in the bar were probably talking to you because you were buying drinks. right? So that's when you live somewhere, you realize that you have to get beyond the economic relationships and try and make real friendships, and it's a big challenge making friends in other cultures. Um, that is something I think people misunderstand, is the difference between being a visitor and living in a place. But more
Mm,
specific to Japan, what do people misunderstand? Um, English being useful is English is useful in Japan, but Japan has a very low English level. You'd be surprised. I've seen many European people in hotels getting incredibly frustrated that the hotel staff can't speak English because they can't. It's not their fault. You're in Japan. You should really be speaking Japanese, right? You can't rely on
mm,
English as the language of communication. And of course, if you go to the expensive hotels in Tokyo, they will speak English because you're paying a premium to go and get the English speaking staff there. Um, but like in the city where I live, no one, very few English speakers. No restaurant staff speak English because they're not high paid jobs, right? They might be paid €5 an hour to work as restaurant staff. You're not going to hire an English speaker in that job usually. Um, so yeah, we're trying to learn a little bit of a few Japanese phrases would go a long way and would help you. Um, there is English present in Japan. A lot of menus are translated badly using online translation tools. And some staff members will know they all learned a little bit of English at school, but it's it's not like when you visit the Netherlands and everyone speaks English, or
mm.
when you can visit parts of, well, you can visit. I went to Taiwan and English was far more spoken in Taiwan than it was in Japan. Um, I think Japan's ranked in the 120th in the world in English speaking, the lowest OECD country, the lowest wealthy country.
Mm.
So it's, yeah, English is not the most useful language here. Um,
But
Something else, if you were
but just
visiting,
to add,
oh, go ahead.
can I just add one thing with my experience visiting Japan as a someone who knew very little Japanese, was pleasantly surprised to find that in lots of the restaurants they do have the plastic replicas of what it is that is on the menu.
Yeah,
So pointing is a lot easier in a Japanese restaurant where you can see a plastic version of your food than
yeah.
it is at some fancy French restaurant where you just get the written version.
Yeah, and also a lot of Japanese restaurants put pictures on their menus, which is also incredibly useful to have pictures on menus. You don't get that very often in the UK, and always surprised when I open a menu. Oh, there's no picture for me to point at in the UK. There's nothing for me to
Mm.
see, but that's useful. Unless you go to a Japanese izakaya, a pub, they tend to just write in Japanese on those menus, so that's where it gets more challenging to order in those situations. I think a second thing people often misunderstand about Japan. I don't think it's not a misunderstanding, but there's a world outside of the typical tourist track. People who come to Japan, and rightly, because they're the famous cool places. They go to Tokyo for a few days. They might go to Mount Fuji. They then might go to Osaka and Kyoto, and if they have the time, they might go across to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But usually, it's Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto. Right, those three cities is where people and stop off at Mount Fuji on the way. But there's a lot of other cool places around Japan. Japan is full of tourist attractions. It's kind of a joke between um, people who live here. Japan has everything's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Wherever you go, there'll be something that's UNESCO World Heritage somewhere, or another Japan Heritage. There's tourist attractions everywhere. Now, I live in a small city in Fukushima, and there is a famous castle here. There is a everything's famous. You'll find out there's famous things everywhere, and you get beautiful regional dishes around the country that you can't eat anywhere else. So I would recommend people to kind of go off the beaten track and avoid being one of those tourists who um, contributes to the damaging over tourism, which is hitting a lot of places. Places like Kyoto have had to ban tourists from going down certain streets. Mount Fuji is putting up barriers to stop people stopping on roads to take photos. because your tourism is inconveniencing normal people's lives, right? You're stopping on the street to take photos is blocking the people who are late to their business meetings, right? So I would encourage people to, go to the less busy places because you still have an amazing experience. You'll still learn. You might learn more about the culture. You'll eat more interesting foods if you don't go to that restaurant you saw on Instagram. Instead, if you go to the local ramen place that's near your hotel, you're probably going to get as good a dish, be as tasty a meal, and you won't be having the same experience as a million other people who have seen that Instagram video. So I think that's what I would always recommend is to go off the beaten track a bit and try and do something a bit different, a bit unique with your time in Japan.
That is excellent advice indeed. Is that the third one? I think do we have two or three?
I can't remember.
Anyway,
Can I think of a third one? If I can think of one quickly, it's Japan is incredibly cold in the winter and incredibly hot in the summer. So if you come in August, it will be 40 degrees Celsius and feel like a sauna. It'll be incredibly high humidity. And if you come in the winter, depends where you go, but it might be 2 meters of snow. Japan is city of Aomori and Sapporo are the two snowiest cities in the world, right? So where I live now, in the winter, there was like a meter of snow outside every day, but in the summer it's 40 degrees. So it fluctuates a lot. So I never assumed this about Japanese. Before I moved to Japan, I had no idea what the weather was like. And when you look at a map, the UK and Japan are kind of equal in where they are, like in relation to the equator. So I assumed, Japan's probably going to be a bit like European weather, but it's not. It's incredibly humid in the summer. It's unpleasant, right? Japanese people complain about the weather all the time, and in the winter it's cold. And Japanese houses are designed to be, especially in the south of Japan, they're designed to be heat resistant, right? To not be too hot in the summer, but that means they're very cold in the winter. So that's something to think about when you plan or you visit Japan, is that the weather might be unexpected. You might come in a tsunami. You might come in not a tsunami, a typhoon. Right? Typhoons are very common in June and July, or in September and October. There are big storms. So the weather here can be sometimes be frustrating. It can be. I'm gearing up now. I've just had to go to the shop yesterday and buy myself new summer clothes because every year I destroy my clothes by sweating far too much in my summer clothes. Like it is incredibly hot. So
okay, well, that is some excellent practical advice to finish on. Tom, I feel like I've learned a huge amount, and I thought I had some idea about Japan and Japanese culture and customs and demographic makeup and stuff, but I've learned a vast amount in our conversation. So thank you so much for being so liberal with your time.
Well, I'm happy to talk about these topics. I think it's great to have this kind of series where you're talking to different people about their experiences, and I wanted to, rather than talk about the typical Japanese foreigner living in Japan experience, I thought I'd talk more about the academic side of things. And I'm sorry if I got anything wrong, if I've made any mistakes, but yeah, please don't leave any hate comments.
Okay, Tom, do you want to let people know where they can kind of find out more about you? I know you make lots of stuff about Japan as well. So if you would like some more, Tom, this is where to get it.
So I host the Thinking in English podcast. You can find that on all podcasting platforms, Spotify, Apple, wherever. We're also on YouTube. We don't make too many YouTube-specific videos, but maybe in the future. But you can listen to all podcasts now on YouTube and YouTube Music. If you want to know more about my life in Japan, Instagram is probably the best place. So that's, again, Thinking in English podcast on Instagram, where I put usually I put posts and stories. I don't make too much stuff for English learners on Instagram. I don't want to be one of those Instagrammers who make English content. I just like posting pictures of mountains and my daily walk by the river. So if you want to see me eat it, or pictures of ramen, right? So if you want to see me in Japan, you can follow me on Instagram. But yeah, Thinking in English podcast.
I think I saw a picture, a video of you drinking sake the other day.
Yeah, I was actually on the TV after that as
Oh,
well.
you're on a TV. Yeah.
I was on
Wow.
the regional TV show because I think I was the only foreigner at that event drinking sake, or I was the only one there when it opened. I did arrive at opening time, which I don't know if it's a good thing to arrive at a sake
The
festival at
headline
opening
said,
time. Yeah,
"Desperate alcoholic
exactly.
alcoholic foreigner can't
Well, they,
can't wait
they,
to drink some sake."
yeah, they asked me why did I come to this event, and I had a few sakes, and my answer was I wanted to drink, which I think I could have been a bit more elaborate with my answer, but that was what I said. So
Very good. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, Tom, and have a wonderful day.
yeah, you too.